Welcome to the Nottingham Business School Business Leaders podcast, where business leaders tell their stories and share their insights. All our guests have a personal connection with Nottingham Business School, so listen, learn, enjoy, and share.
Welcome to another episode of the Nottingham Business School's Business Leaders podcast with me, Mike Sassy. David Edwards is the Managing Director of Seiko UK. He has been a leader in the watchmaking industry for almost a quarter of a century, much of that time spent managing the business of producing luxury timepieces. His career spans several prestigious, globally recognised brands, including Seiko, Richard Mille, Technomarine and Swatch. Since joining Seiko UK in 2018, David has overseen the company's strategic direction and operations. Seiko watches sell for hundreds into thousands of pounds, and last year the company celebrated 100 years since it made its first wristwatch. Part of David's leadership role is to maintain the brand's legacy of craftsmanship, while at the same time embracing the modern trends that keep it relevant in a rapidly changing market. And it looks like he's not doing a bad job, because Seiko has been Britain's watch brand of the year for 4 of the last 5 years. So David, thank you very much for joining us on this episode of Nottingham Business School's Business Leaders podcast.
Thank you, Mike. Absolute pleasure. And it's quite an intro there.
Yes, indeed. Right. So, but I'll tell you what, let's expand on that then. Your title's MD of Seiko UK. What does that role entail, and how does it fit into the world of watches?
Yeah, I mean, at a purely functional level, I'm responsible for the UK subsidiary. It's 100% owned by Seiko Group Corporation, which is the Tokyo Stock Exchange listed parent company. So it's a big beast over in Tokyo, and has a number of businesses beyond watches. So my role and responsibility is for the UK entity. I look after around 70 people, and our responsibility is for the UK, for Ireland, and strangely South Africa. But those are the 3 territories that we look after from here. I mean, within the Seiko Group Corporation, watches is still the majority of the business. Around about 67% of the group turnover is from the watch business. So clearly that's our main area. And we've been around since 1881, which is surprising to many folks, but it's a long-established business. Obviously, it wasn't listed back in 1881, but it's grown through those years. I mean, from a UK perspective, the UK was one of the first markets, actually, that Seiko entered outside of Japan after the States. So we're going back to the early 70s here. So it's been a long time player in the UK market, and clearly the UK watch market has changed many times since the 1970s. But a lot of people perhaps associate Seiko with quartz, and depending if you're a Swiss brand or not, you might refer to it as the quartz crisis, or we tend to prefer the quartz revolution. So
go and explain that then. Sorry, I'm to the layman.
Yes, of course. Well, most people would think about quartz watches as the typical watch, but back in the early 70s, quartz was a huge revolution, and of course what it brought was accuracy at a relatively affordable price. Ironically, when the first quartz watches came out in 1969, they were about the price of a small family car. So far from the tickers that you might think about today up and down the high streets. But the quartz revolution, as we called it, kind of halted to some extent the traditional watch, the kind of watch that you would wind up.
Right, and that was the difference. That was the key difference, wasn't it?
Yes, exactly. Or maybe it's automatic, so it moves with your wrist movement. But quartz was a Seiko innovation, and back in the 70s when it first came about, you can imagine for the traditional watch market, it was a big shock. And created quite a lot of upheaval at that time. So a lot of people still associate Seiko with quartz, but obviously things have moved on a lot since then.
But it's still an iconic brand, isn't it? I mean, I see it every time I turn on Sky Sports, where I think you sponsor the news. I see Seiko when I watch World Athletics on the telly, and they use Seiko for the timing. What particular leadership challenges does that pose for you? Managing such an iconic brand here in Britain.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, we can't forget we are part of a global business, and,
Sure.
and the product innovation clearly is a Tokyo-driven function. I guess, for us, because of what I've just explained, the brand's been around for a long time in the UK, and people's perceptions of any brand vary over time. And so, the court story that I was just telling you about there would be for certain generations, whereas the more recent one, it's not a thing. And maybe they don't quite have the same understanding or knowledge of the brand. So it's a similar, I guess, challenge for any heritage brand. We have to keep ourselves at the forefront, whether that's through product, whether it's through our communication style, because certainly that's changed a lot, absolutely since the 70s, but arguably since COVID, to bring it right up to date. So yeah, there's been a huge shift in
Okay.
that.
And so you talked about COVID there. There haven't been changes since then. What kind of changes are you talking about?
Yeah, well, the most obvious one is that people weren't going out shopping in the traditional way. Clearly, retail kind of stopped for a while, didn't it? But on the other hand, a lot of people were working from home if they were able to, and that meant the work-life balance, the time on their hands was a little bit more. And in a business like ours, where it is quite technical, as you said, please explain to me what do you mean by quartz. Well, there's a classic. People who had a natural interest had a bit more time, and we found that they wanted to know more about brands. They wanted to know more about the technology. So that meant our marketing communications had to change. We're lucky that we have a business and a brand that's been around for a long time, lots of innovations through those years, and we have a rich story to tell. Whether that's on the Seiko brand, which is the more sort of accessible 500 to £2,000 area, or whether it's our Grand Seiko, which is the luxury line, typically at five to £10,000 and beyond. And if you're buying into that level of product, clearly you want to know what's behind that, not just the shiny ad that you might see in a magazine. So that gave us a whole new way of communicating with an audience. And I have to tell you, from our point of view, it gave us a real boost. And we really took the business above and beyond from those COVID years, and partly through developing our ecom offer, which was not something we were particularly strong on. So I think, as they say, from crisis sometimes comes positivity, and for us, I guess we pivoted the way that we spoke to our consumers, and how we informed them about the brand and the history and the product.
I mean that idea of constant change. It's the big leadership issue at the moment, isn't it?
It is. I mean, I think we're part of a Japanese business, of course. So whilst we in Seiko UK are absolutely a UK business, there are elements of that creep in, and constant innovation, even if it's just modest steps. Well, our company motto, for example, is one step ahead of the rest, and it's one step. It's not one leap. It's one step, and it's one step ahead. In other words, if you're slightly behind, or if you're too far advanced, that's not a good place to be. And I think from a very simple statement, that kind of, I guess it sums up quite a lot about what we're about as our business, and that's come from our founder, Kentaro Hattori, back in 1881, and it's something that still holds true now. So yeah, keeping ahead is very much part of our DNA.
And you again, you talked about Japan as an MD in the UK. You have your parent companies in Japan. Your products are made in Japan. Your Japan-based execs on your UK board. How do you navigate the complexities of modern leadership in a global industry?
Yeah, we don't have any Japanese people in the UK business anymore. Yes, you're quite right. They are on the board, but they're not physically based in the UK. So it is fundamentally a UK operation run by UK people, British people. But the watch industry absolutely is the ultimate global industry. It's the same product in whichever market consumers are going to see it. We're not into this adaptation of the recipe for local markets. So, we are very much a global business, but, within that, the distribution structures can be quite different. Consumers can be quite different. And, it's long been known in the watch business that, there are certain markets who were early adopters of multiple purchases. You had to have a different watch for a different occasion. And then, the good old British, typically at that time, were 1.5 watches. It was the one your dad might have given you, or the one that you got with your first paycheck. And so we were quite late into that multiple ownership piece. It's very different now. So, the point is, yes, it's a global product, but the way that it's marketed, the way that consumers buy into that product is quite different across the globe, for sure.
And what about you? What about you running the business, as it were, across borders? You having to, speak to people in different time zones and things of that nature. Does that present particular challenges for your leadership?
Yeah, I mean, if I go back to RM, Richard Mille, where it was an EMEA, including Russia back then, absolutely the time zone and the language barriers were perhaps a challenge. We're lucky in a way. I mean, South Africa doesn't have a different time zone, so that's a plus. We certainly benefit from that, and of course, no linguistic issues either. But yeah, again, there are different ways of doing business, of course, and my job as MD of Seiko UK is to make sure that we operate consistently where that's possible to do so.
Sure. I mean, you so in terms of yourself now, you spent the best part of, I don't know age here, but quarter of a century working in luxury brands. You talked about Richard Mille there, and who your previous employer, which is again a very luxury brand. But you presume you look as though you are representing watches that some of them are encrusted with diamonds. They use aerospace grade precious metals, I read in the PR. You're managing a lot of high tech prestige and the customers who go with that. I mean, sort of thing keep you awake at night? How do you deal with it?
Huge fun, actually, and a real privilege. And if I look back to my early days of working in plastic housewares, where I was trying to promote dog bowls and garden accessories. Look, I mean, to work with that kind of product in that kind of space is an absolute privilege. And yeah, if we talk about aerospace and diamonds, that was very much Richard Mille area, and it was huge fun. Highly. It was challenging because, of course, the customer that we're dealing with, the end client, is by virtue a high net worth individual. They have choices, and they've experienced the very best of the very best. And so, as a brand, it wasn't so much about trying to find new customers, because actually customers find you at that level, and the production is so small that often you're in a position of managing allocation as opposed to finding new sales. So then it becomes one of relationship, and it becomes one of customer service, and how we treat people, how we communicate with people, how we keep them on board of new additions that might be coming up in the future, and of course some very funky events along the way, things that they may not have done before, and that's incredibly hard with that kind of consumer group who have experienced an awful lot and do get invited to everything. But huge fun, and no, it didn't keep me awake at night particularly. Might just maybe the odd late event.
So you've been a business leader for decades. Full disclosure, your MBA is from here at Nottingham Business School. So what do you know now that you wish you'd known when you'd started out on your career?
Yeah, I mean, my background, as you say, was marketing, and then I moved into sales. And I guess as a young marketeer, I wasn't really sure if marketeers could become MDs and CEOs, because actually most of them seem to be chartered accountants or very privileged backgrounds and elite education, and so I wasn't entirely sure that route was open to me. But I always had this idea that if I built appropriate experience and worked with the right kind of people and took from them, that maybe there was a route, and you know what, there is, and I did it. And yeah, but back then I wasn't terribly sure. I think it's a different space now. I mean, you graciously try not to age me with my experience, Mike, but I am the wrong end of 50, and the world is a different place these days, and it wasn't back in the sort of late 80s when I was coming into the workplace. I think looking back now, I probably wasn't as forthright or prepared to share an opinion. And maybe that was a bit of a confidence thing. I don't know.
Is that right? For somebody in marketing, in sales, you you held back somewhat, did you?
Held back somewhat. I think it's about if you're on your subject or not. If you're invited to a marketing conference, that's one thing. If you're sat around a table with people from around the business, and these are experienced or senior or well-regarded managers of different functions, the point I'm making is trying to take an interest and be interested in other parts of the business rather than just your functional speciality. And I saw myself very much as a marketeer back then. So yeah, trying to learn from other people, trying to voice an opinion, not being afraid to do so. It was probably something I didn't do enough of. I think also building networks. I wasn't particularly great outside of the business. Inside the business, yes, but I think looking back now, that's an essential skill. It's definitely something that I would encourage anybody to do in the early part of their career.
And it's interesting you say that because, as you say, you started in marketing, moved into sales. That idea of people skills, how important is it for for leaders to have good people skills rather than, say, being just simply highly intelligent or driven to succeed?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I get there are examples of both, of course, and particularly in today's tech world, where that deep understanding of a very specific area of tech will transport you from one place to another. I think definitely people skills will always be important, and for me, super important. It's not a case of one or the other. Clearly, there needs to be fact, knowledge based experience in order to be credible with your peers and your team. But undoubtedly, communication has featured throughout my career, not just as a marketeer, but as I got up through the management ranks and building teams and sharing the vision and bringing people along with you, absolutely essential, and that's people skills.
So now we're going to take a quick break from our chat to mention the MBA programs at Nottingham Business School. As we've learned from many of our guests, effective business leadership is about confidence, adaptability, and thinking strategically. These are the key ingredients to delivering innovation and impact in crowded, competitive markets. So, if you are ready to transform your career, visit ntu.ac.uk/MBA to explore the MBA programs at Nottingham Business School. We're one of only 1% of business schools worldwide who hold the prestigious Triple Crown accreditation. That's ntu.ac.uk/MBA to find out more. Now back to the show. A lot of people who come on this, a lot of leaders who come on this pod say, yep, everything we've said so far, but my goodness, what they don't tell you is that it's lonely at the top. And that's when you fall back on, I don't know, mentors and they talk about the importance of work-life balance. I mean, we've talked off pod about sailing, about skiing with your family, all these things of having something outside of work that enables you to carry on your leadership to maximum potential. Is that something you recognise?
I don't think I personally would say it's lonely at the top. I mean, firstly, I also have bosses and my bosses have bosses, so there's always, what's the top. But I've always tried to maintain a really close working relationship with my senior team, definitely. It's super important, and it's always been part of what I'm about and what I do. I mean, clearly there are moments, but I've never had a mentor, actually. I've never felt the need to reach out for that. Certainly, people have contacted me, and maybe the odd boss in the past. We have an informal catch up every now and again, but it's far from a formal mentoring program. So no, I can't really speak to that. It's not something I've ever done, and I guess that also speaks to the fact I've never felt particularly lonely in doing my job.
Right. Okay. And so, wow. I've never had an answer like that. So what I'm thinking is, how have you managed to do that? What do you think it is?
I don't know. Look, I can only speak about my experience and in the roles and companies that I work in. But as I say, for me, I am a very open individual. I do value input. I actively encourage my senior team to tell me exactly what they think. And equally, the managers across the business, I have a monthly managers meeting, for example, which gives me an opportunity to also share ideas around the business, but for them to also input on that and fundamentally take them beyond their functional management responsibility. I'm kind of looking at that as, where are the leaders of tomorrow coming from? So it works in two ways. But I guess for me, maybe that's also a way of bouncing ideas off people, sensing what the reaction might be, as opposed to this kind of commandment from on high, in your lonely, lofty position. That's not my style.
Okay, so you've had lots of senior leadership roles: Seiko, Richard Mille, Technomarine. Looking back, What's the most difficult leadership situation that you've had to tackle, and if you had your time again, how would you do it differently?
Mm. I think actually the Seiko role or Seiko position was probably the most testing. I knew before I was appointed that there was some restructuring required in that business, and I think anybody that's been through that on either side, actually, it's clearly a painful process. In a way, back to your communication question, the solution wasn't difficult. It was pretty clear what needed to happen, why it needed to happen, and where we would go from there. But of course, making it happen as painlessly as possible and with respect to everyone is the challenge. And yeah, again, back to the senior team, really imperative that everybody was on board, and it affected everybody across the business. Everybody was going to feel part of this. So the senior managers involved also had to fully buy into that. And yeah, look, it wasn't something that I would reflect back and think, could I have done it differently? Should I have done it differently? Actually, the answer would be what we did, why we did it was absolutely correct. And in fact, the business has grown and flourished since that. So, I feel comfortable that the decisions we took at the time, albeit painful, were the right ones. But no, looking back, I don't think we would have done anything differently at all.
Mm. And conversely, what are you most proud of? What do you look back and say, goodness, I'm glad I took that decision. I'm glad we did that way. And hey, look at how it ended out.
I've talked about Seiko, but if I go back to my Richard Mille days, that I joined in 2009, and Richard Mille was a very small company back then, and I remember distinctly not being able to recruit people into the business because people weren't sure from the industry if it was a long-term success or if it was, quotes, a marketing brand, end quotes. And a couple of years later, nearly all those people started ringing me and saying, "Hey, David, we spoke a couple of years ago, and you quite liked me." And I said, "Yes, but you turned me down. Well, can I join you now?" And I guess sometimes you just don't know how things are going to pan out, and that was the same for me. And I remember my wife saying to me, "Do you really want to go and work for another watch brand?" And I said, "Richard Mille is different," because I felt it was. And for the next 9 years, it was a roller coaster at times, but it was a phenomenally exciting and ultimately successful time. And I was involved in driving distribution changes, opening boutiques around Europe, Middle East, and Africa, recruiting a team, developing a team, and ultimately, when I left in 2018, it was a very different business. So
Because it was, did you
from
join
one
it as a
point to
startup,
another.
or did you how early in the process? Because it was so just again for context, it was a prestigious startup of very expensive watches. As I say, it started right at the bottom, and were you there right from the start, and it's grown into a real exclusive brand now, hasn't it?
Yeah, it has. I mean, for context, no. So Richard himself started the business in 99, 2000, and then for the next 6 years, kind of did everything himself from Paris with a very small team. And then in 2007, this business was established to become the distributor for Europe, Middle East, and Africa. And that's the business I joined 2 years after it had started. So in many ways, it was very much like a startup, although it had this amazing brand and product genius in Richard. But it was a very small business. I think it was literally 6 or 8 people, including a couple of watchmakers when I joined. So building that team out to then open 13, 14 monobrand boutiques over a period of 3 years was quite a high growth business with all the things that you would imagine going with a high growth business. Lots of fun, lots of excitement, a little bit seat of the pants at the time, but bringing processes into play to build out what ultimately was a hugely successful business.
Mm. So I'm duty bound to ask you this. So what made you leave?
Mm. Well, yeah, you're not the first person to have asked me that question. In fact, it did come up at my Seiko interviews many, many, many times. Um, as you probably appreciate, there was an awful lot of fun and excitement that went along with that kind of brand of business, and it's great. It's a bit like your first long haul flight. Once you've done it a couple of times, it ceases to be less exciting. But I think for me, I felt that in 2018, I had probably done as much as I could do and perhaps wanted to do. in that space. And when Seiko contacted me and asked me about joining them, I was a little bit skeptical from a pure sort of brand perspective. But when they explained the organizational changes and their plans for growth and how they wanted to completely change the distribution and the price architecture of the brands, I was all in. It was a very easy decision. So yeah, very, very different business.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay. Good stuff. So, as you know, this is a podcast for the business school, Nottingham Business School, a place you're familiar with, a place full of leaders, future leaders. So if I ask you to look over your shoulder and give my colleagues one piece of leadership advice from your own experiences, what might that be?
An old manager of mine once said, never forget that the people that you're managing are looking to you for the way that they ought to manage their careers as well. And I thought actually that's quite a big responsibility, because I think certainly when you're a young or a mid-manager, you're just interested in doing the best job you possibly can. Often you've been taken out of your functional zone and you become a manager. And do you have the requisite skills to be that manager, or are you just there because you were really good at your job? It's that classic dilemma. And I struggled with that to begin with, for sure, because I still wanted to be really good at my job. But actually, my job was managing people and getting results through people and developing people. And I still have these conversations today, because to be a good manager, to be a good leader, I think you do need to give up some of your own perhaps passions in work terms to properly develop people. And it's easy to say, and sometimes it's difficult to do. But I think, yeah, when you have in your mind that the team are looking to you for direction, guidance, leadership, it's a big responsibility, and you've got to take it seriously. But I've enjoyed the journey. I've had some fun times, I've had some dark times, but I think from my days managing plastic housewares to, as you call it, diamond encrusted aerospace watches, for millions of pounds, actually, in some cases. That was quite a journey from a product and a business perspective, but actually a lot of the same things apply, whatever the product.
Great stuff. David Edwards, MD of Seiko UK. It has been a great pleasure to talk to you on this episode of Nottingham Business School's Business Leaders Podcast. Thanks very much.
Pleasure. Thank you, Mike.
If you enjoyed this episode of the NBS Business Leaders Podcast with David Edwards, why not listen to previous shows with the CMO of Boots UK, Pete Markey, the CEO of Capital One UK, Lucy Haighes, MBE, or the former CEO of ASOS, Nick Beaton. The NBS Business Leaders Podcast is produced for Nottingham Trent University by Russell Bingley and presented by Mike Sassy.